in his career, a psychologist named Robert Cialdini set out to study persuasion. Now, most young academic scholars start in the library and then end in the lab. First, you learn what other scholars have had to say on a topic, and then you build on their findings, developing your own theories, and then finally, you design experiments to test your hypotheses. And Cialdini certainly did that. But he also took a detour along the way to briefly become an encyclopedia salesman. Or at least, he went through the sales training that would-be encyclopedia salesmen are required to go through. And also the training for vacuum cleaner salesmen, and for portrait photography salespeople, and for those selling dance lessons. In between trips to the library and studies run in the lab, he would answer newspaper ads for sales positions and would willingly go and receive the training. He also interviewed and observed successful salespeople and the people they sold to, and people working in fundraising and advertising, and also police officers tasked with investigating sales fraud. He did extensive fieldwork on the topic of how people persuade others, looking for similarities across the methods of what he calls compliance professionals. And then he took those insights into the lab to test which methods worked best and to figure out why. The end result has been a staggering amount of research into the social influences on decision-making. How people's choices and decisions are influenced by the intentional and incidental behavior of other people. I start off with a story about Cialdini because if you've read his books, and I really can't recommend them highly enough, please do read them, then you will know that I am relying extensively on his work in covering this topic. In my defense, I don't think it's possible to cover the topic of social influences on decision-making without paying homage to Bob Cialdini. Today, we're going to cover 3 principles of social influence that arise from Cialdini's research. 3 ways that the behaviors of other people can affect our decision-making. These principles are reciprocation, social proof, and authority. First, let's talk about reciprocation. Reciprocation is the idea that when we receive something from others, we tend to feel obligated to respond in kind. Someone does something nice for you, you want to do something nice for them. Quid pro quo. It is debatable whether this tendency to reciprocate, what Cialdini calls a psychological burden of debt, is a purely social phenomenon, or whether it might have evolutionary or even biological roots. What is clear is that some degree of reciprocation is necessary in order for society to function properly. Reciprocation, in fact, serves as the cornerstone of civilization. The anthropologist Richard Leakey noted that our ancestors learned to share food and skills in an honored network of obligation. And the cultural anthropologist Robin Fox has argued that for a division of labor and exchange of goods to operate, humans required a web of indebtedness. Whatever its origin, the compulsion to reciprocate is deep-seated and powerful, and thus a strong influence on the decisions that we make. Suppose, for example, that you are faced with a decision of whether or not to make a donation to a charity. Well, charities and nonprofits are well aware of the power of reciprocation when asking you to make a decision. For example, it was common for Hare Krishnas to give passers-by a flower or a small book of scripture before asking for a donation. When someone has given you a gift, there's some social pressure to respond to a request from the giver. This is why you receive so many letters requesting donations that come with address labels or some other small gift. I had an MBA student who had worked in charitable giving, and she said people from her office would never visit a potential donor without bringing some small token of appreciation. Always gift something before you ask for money. You can see parallel behavior from servers in many restaurants, who will sometimes give you something you didn't order. Surprising as it may seem, Even something as simple as including some mints along with the bill has been found to lead to bigger tips. Some researchers tested the power of reciprocity in a field study with a company that sold insurance to small businesses. This company wanted to conduct some market research in order to improve its sales process. But as you might imagine, getting the owners or managers of small businesses to take the time to fill out a survey on insurance, well, they tended to have a pretty low response rate. So they conducted an experiment. They randomly assigned the small businesses on their mailing lists to receive one of 8 different mailers. Some people received just the survey, politely asking for a response. About 20% of small businesses in this condition sent the survey back, which is objectively low for the purposes of getting good data. People in the other 7 conditions all got the same survey, but there was also something else included in the envelope. In 2 of the conditions, the surveys came with cash, either a $1 or a $5 bill. In another 4 conditions, the surveys came with checks made out to the receiver in the amounts of $5, $10, $20, or $40. And in the last condition, survey recipients were told that if they filled out the survey and returned it, then they would be mailed the check for $50 as compensation for their time. Response rates went up in all 6 of the reciprocation conditions. When people opened the envelope and found $1 in there, no strings attached, the response rates doubled from about $20, from about 20% to about 40%. And it went up even more if there was a $5 bill in there, up to about 50%. When the survey included a check, recipients seemed to be relatively insensitive to the actual amount of the gift. From $5 all the way up to $40, all of the response rates hovered a little north of 50%. But when people were not offered a gift of some money, but were instead offered an exchange of money for their time, well, that $50 offered in exchange for a completed survey netted only a 23% response rate, which was almost the same as offering people nothing at all. So, in this scenario, business owners were confronted with a choice to fill out the survey or to not fill out the survey. And for many owners, receiving a gift up front influenced that choice. The gift seems to have prompted them to think, "You've done me a favor, so I guess I owe you one in return." And that thought seems to have driven a specific decision to fill out the survey. Reciprocation can be a powerful tool in sales and negotiation settings. In particular, reciprocation is at the core of something called the door-in-the-face technique. This tactic starts by asking someone for something large, something that they are likely to reject, a big ask. Then, after the rejection, the negotiator follows up with a smaller request. If that sounds unlikely to work, imagine yourself in the following scenario. Some high school student knocks on your door and asks you if you'd be willing to buy a couple of $1 candy bars for a fundraiser for the marching band. You have a decision to make. Would you buy the candy bars? Probably not, because those fundraiser candy bars are consistently terrible. So, you politely decline and close the door. Now, imagine that instead, the teenager had asked you if you'd like to buy a $10 raffle ticket as part of the fundraiser. You politely decline. $10 is a lot of money for something like that. And then this earnest young person follows up with, "Well, if the raffle doesn't interest you, would you be willing to buy a couple of $1 candy bars to support the band?" Now, be honest, doesn't it seem like more likely that you would decide to buy the candy in the second scenario rather than the first? The candy bars are going to be just as bad. But after having heard and rejected the larger request, the candy just seems more reasonable by comparison, doesn't it? The principle at play here is what's known as reciprocal concessions. After you reject the initial offer, the negotiator or salesperson magnanimously comes back with something that you are more likely to find appealing. It's not what he or she really wanted, of course. That was what they started with. But they're going to be generous and meet you halfway. Isn't that nice of them? And because they've been nice to you, yes, that's right, reciprocation kicks in, and you feel some pressure to respond in kind. Your decision-making process has just been manipulated. Sure, your preferred position is to walk away and not donate any money. But he did just move away from his preferred position, so maybe you owe it to him to budge a little bit too. What makes this logic particularly ridiculous, of course, is that we are remarkably insensitive to the starting point. You can make almost anything seem more reasonable or more attractive by just going more extreme with that first request or bid or proposal. In other words, people will often decide to meet you halfway at a point they never would have decided to go to if there hadn't been that initial offer. Our friend Cialdini and some colleagues ran an experiment in the 1970s where they stopped college students on campus and told them they were representatives from a county youth counseling program, and they were looking for volunteers. They asked if the students would be willing to chaperone a group of juvenile delinquents on a day trip to the zoo. It was the 1970s. They could still say things like juvenile delinquents back then. I'm sure it won't surprise you at all to hear that most people said no. Only 17% agreed to go on the zoo trip. But another group of students got the door-in-the-face treatment. These students were first asked if they would be willing to volunteer for 2 hours per week as a counselor to these juvenile delinquents for a minimum of 2 years. Yeah, pretty much everybody said no to that. But then, after refusing the big request, this group was asked if they'd be willing to chaperone the trip to the zoo. The number of people agreeing to go on the zoo trip jumped up to 50%. Reciprocation isn't automatic, of course. There are a few things that need to happen in order for someone's act of kindness to generate feelings of reciprocity. First, the gift must be understood as a gift, as something extra or unexpected. If it is interpreted as fulfilling an obligation or as nothing out of the ordinary, then it's less likely to trigger reciprocity. So, if you want to increase your tips, according to the research that's been done on this, you should give the diners at your table a mint along with the bill. But you know what works even better than giving someone a mint? Giving them 2 mints. Giving someone a mint has come to be seen as not exactly required, but still fairly common. But 2 mints is a relatively uncommon thing, and so more likely to be interpreted as a kind gesture, which tends to prompt kindness in return, in the form of a bigger tip. And you know what works even better than giving someone 2 mints? Giving them 1 mint, taking a few steps away from the table, then turning back around and saying, you know what, for you folks, I'm going to make it 2 mints apiece. Tips go through the roof. The other key requirement in order for reciprocity to affect decision-making is that the gift or concession must seem sincere. If someone makes a gesture that's interpreted as being purely strategic or mercenary, well, then people feel no obligation to return that gesture. This point was beautifully illustrated in a Calvin and Hobbes cartoon a few years ago. Calvin asks, "Mom, can I set fire to my bed mattress?" To which Mother calmly replies, "No, Calvin." "Then can I ride my tricycle on the roof?" "No, Calvin." "Then can I have a cookie?" "No, Calvin." And Calvin thinks in the last frame, she's on to me. And indeed she was on to him. Perceived insincerity is part of the reason you are so able to decide against all of those donation appeals that come with the address stickers or with a carnation. Due in no small part to the popularity of books by Professor Cialdini, organizations have figured out that this reciprocity thing works great. And so they have all implemented programs designed to activate reciprocity in their customers and their potential donors. And the rest of us have noticed. And those appeals have lost a lot of their power because we now realize that many of them are insincere. Like Calvin's mom, we're all onto them. The next influence on decision-making that we'll talk about is social proof. Social proof refers to the idea that we tend to behave in ways that are consistent with what we perceive to be the social norms and the preferences of others. Basically, social proof is just a fancy psychology term for peer pressure. But as with reciprocity, social proof, simple as it is, can have a surprisingly strong influence on the decisions that we make. Social proof is part of why things go viral. Popularity begets popularity. There are lots of examples of celebrities, movies, books, and activities that seem to have no redeeming value on their own, but that somehow become inexplicably popular. Perhaps the most egregious example I know of is the phenomenal success of the 50 Shades of Grey books. Now, I have not read the books, or at least I will certainly not admit to having read them while I'm standing in front of a camera, but I have it on good authority from those who have read them that they're terrible. Plot, characters, writing, all of it, just awful. A review in The New Yorker put it this way, quote, "No new reader, however charitable, could open 50 Shades of Grey, browse a few paragraphs, and reasonably conclude that the author was writing in her first language, or even her fourth." I'm told by friends who are able to pass judgment on such things that even relative to the standards of bawdy romance novels, 50 Shades of Grey fares poorly. It is, according to any objective measure we can use to evaluate fiction, a terrible book. It also happens to be, by some measures, the best-selling novel of all time. More than 60 million copies sold at the time of this taping. So why would all of these people choose to buy this terrible book? Well, I've read a number of different attempts by academics and pundits to try to explain the success of 50 Shades of Grey. And the only one that I have found compelling is social proof. It was released as free fan fiction, and a few people read it and then started talking about it. And then as more people read it, more people started to figure out, well, there must be something to it. And so they read it and talked about it. And the virus spread. That's the best explanation I have for why millions of people would choose to read 50 Shades of Grey. The second best explanation I have is that it's a sign of the end times, that civilization will soon be coming to an end, so we should all probably start hoarding canned food and ammunition. But it's definitely one of those two things, either social proof or Armageddon. Marketers long ago figured out the power of telling potential customers that everyone else is doing it. This is why we see #1 bestseller promoted in ads and on displays so frequently. On this tactic, I've noticed something fascinating in the way that movies are promoted. You'll see ads for a movie in the weeks leading up to a movie release to try to gin up some demand and get a great turnout on opening weekend. But then, after a film has opened, studios will continue to promote it for another couple of weeks. And if you pay attention to the claims that they make, you'll notice something interesting. If the movie did well on opening weekend, then the commercials write themselves. Come see the #1 movie in America. But if the movie didn't take the top spot, the marketers are hardly deterred. They'll pick some category or genre that allows them to make the claim. Come see the #1 comedy in America. And from there, the categories will just keep getting narrower and narrower until they can claim #1 status. Come see the #1 family comedy in America, or the #1 animated family comedy, or the #1 animated family comedy featuring a talking lizard. I have a friend who loves to use the power of social proof for evil, or at least for his own entertainment. He loves to walk down a busy street in a large city and then just stop on the sidewalk and stare up at a building, a look of confusion and curiosity on his face. Before long, some other curious person will also stop and try to see what's making him so confused. And from there, it will snowball. If you see a small group of people standing on the sidewalk, all looking in the same direction, with a look of befuddlement, you are probably going to stop too and try to figure out what they're looking at. And soon, that small group becomes a large group. And it is at this point that my friend simply walks away, leaving the group with no one who has any idea what they're looking at. Evil. Hilarious, but evil. Once you know to look for it, you can find evidence of social proof everywhere, including examples of people turning social proof to their advantage. If you've ever worked a job with a tip jar, you were probably told on your very first day, never empty the jar completely. Bartenders and hostesses and buskers refer to this as salting the tip jar. When the jar is empty, the subtle signal that customers get is that the social norm is not to tip. After all, apparently no one else is doing it, right? Look at the empty jar. When there are some bills and coins in the jar, on the other hand, the signal is that here people do tip, and that subtle pressure applied through social proof is effective. Faced with the decision to tip or not to tip, people are more likely to cough up some cash if the jar is not empty. All right, I've given you some pretty self-serving examples of people using social proof to influence your decisions. Let me give you a more uplifting example. It turns out that social proof can also be used to help people lead more normal lives. In the 1960s, some researchers worked with a group of children who had a phobia of dogs. There are various therapies that can be tried to overcome debilitating terror of something. What these researchers did was remarkably simple. They had these young children come into an office, and they would just watch another child play with a dog for about 20 minutes. That's it. Then the next day, they'd come back and watch the kid play with the dog again for another 20 minutes. And they would repeat this exercise every day. After just 4 days of this treatment, of watching another child play with a dog, 2/3 of the study participants were willing to climb into a playpen with a dog and stay there, even after all the adults left the room. 4 days. That was all it took to go from phobia to close contact. And all through the power of social proof. When we see someone else doing something, that normalizes that behavior. It makes it seem more reasonable and appropriate. Consistent with the idea that it was social proof driving this effect, subsequent research found that the effect was even stronger when, instead of seeing just one child playing with the dog, participants watched a variety of children playing with a dog. Social proof. The last type of social influence that we'll talk about today is authority. Authority refers to the propensity for people to decide in ways that are thought to be in line with the desires of perceived authority figures. In short, we tend to comply with authority. The most famous example of this principle is the notorious Milgram compliance experiments. In these experiments, primarily conducted in the 1960s, people were brought into a room and told they'd be participating in a research study on memory. One experimental subject took on the role of the learner. This person was actually an actor hired by the experimenter. And this person was hooked up to wires that would provide an electric shock anytime he got a question wrong on a memory test. The role of the participant, the person whose reaction was the real focus of the study, was the teacher. His or her job was to administer the electric shocks. There was a third person in the room. This person was the experimenter, the one running the experiment. He would let the teacher know when to administer the shocks and in what voltage. What these experiments found is that people were appallingly compliant to authority. The electric shocks were fake. The actor just pretended to writhe in agony, but they seemed real to the people pressing the button. The experimental participants would get visibly upset. They would stutter and sweat and twist their hands. Some would beg the experimenter to stop, but a surprising number of them just kept on pressing that button when they were instructed to. And if people were willing to respond to authority in a setting where the outcome was so psychologically torturous, you'd better believe that we expect compliance with authority to be generally powerful in less extreme situations as well. As with the other social influences we've talked about today, it's not crazy for someone to defer to authority. Where this gets tricky is when we defer not to legitimate authority, but to our perceptions of authority based on setting or behavior or environmental cues. So the authority figure in the Milgram experiment wasn't a legitimate authority. It wasn't a police officer or your boss or an army colonel. This was just some guy. In some of the experiments, he was wearing a lab coat, and he was running a psychology experiment that you agreed to participate in. But in that situation, he seemed like an authority figure. And so people responded as if that authority were real and valid. They could have chosen to stop applying those electric shocks, but the mere perception of an authority figure in the room led them to make the morally dubious decision to continue. Once again, marketers have cottoned on to the power of authority in persuasive messaging, which is why you will find the trappings of authority in ads and other marketing communications. People who are giving you advice in ads will often be dressed or look or act in such a way as to make them seem important, to seem like they have some authority. My favorite example of this comes from a 1984 commercial for the cough medicine Vicks Formula 44. The actor, Chris Robinson, who played a doctor on the soap opera General Hospital, opened the ads with these immortal words: "I'm not a doctor, but I play one on TV." He then went on to extol the virtues of this over-the-counter cough suppressant. And why was it relevant that he plays a doctor on TV? It's not relevant, not even a little. But the advertiser's hope is that because some people associate him with the role of doctor, that authority will influence them to choose Vicks over a competitor's brand. Even the fact that he kind of looked like a stereotypical young, handsome professional might carry some weight, might influence people to pay more attention to him and to value what he says. So, today we've discussed 3 social influences on decision-making: reciprocation, social proof, and authority. That is by no means an exhaustive list of the ways other people can influence our choices. But these 3 in particular are powerful and robust factors that guide many of the decisions that we make. From feeling compelled to make choices that respond to another person's gestures in kind, to looking to the decisions of others for guidance in our own decision-making, to making decisions that comply with the preferences of those we perceive as powerful in some way. Our decision-making is often influenced in subtle ways by the people around us. Sometimes those buttons and switches that control our decision-making machinery are pushed and toggled by others and not by ourselves.